or Leviticus 22, let's call this one mercy, because this is going to be a rule as opposed to one that will jump to the New Testament to see how Jesus emphasizes it's important or gives us insight into it. He's going to use this one to emphasize a different principle, and that's God's mercy. And so the rule here that we're going to focus on is in verse 10 of Leviticus 22, where it reads, "A layperson shall not eat of a holy thing. No foreign guest of the priest or hired worker shall eat of a holy thing." And that is going to invoke a lesson or two or three that we're going to see in Matthew chapter 12 when Jesus is contending with the Pharisees as his disciples are picking heads of grain to feed themselves on the Sabbath. They're going to contend with him beginning at verse 1. It's going to say, "At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath.' He said to them, 'Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priest?'" I'll pause there because ultimately what he is saying is David clearly broke the law. David clearly broke this law in Leviticus 22. But it's not so much that the exception defied the rule as much as the exception emphasized God's mercy. That's the title that we chose for this particular day. And ultimately, he's going to go on to emphasize another lesson in verse 5 where it reads, "Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and yet are guiltless?" Well, somebody has to attend to what's going on in the temple or the tabernacle, but there was no specific caveat written out in the law for them. And so even though they were the only ones working on the Sabbath, that exception did not negate the rule, once again, as much as it emphasized God's mercy. And so understand that when we are looking at this chapter in context, what we are seeing are situations where the Pharisees got so gassed up, as sometimes the colloquialism will go, that they were more emphasizing the rules than they were the people for whom the rules were designed to bring relief. See, they didn't care whether or not the disciples were hungry, and picking heads of grain on the Sabbath was probably exactly what God was intending for people to do when he said, "Leave portions of your land for the poor and the traveler." Likewise, it's going to go on to say in verses 9 through 14 that there was a man with a withered hand, and they intentionally brought him to him to see if he would go further and do a healing on the Sabbath in contradiction with their tradition. Once again, they didn't care about the man who had the potential to be healed by this great teacher who was doing great healings. They simply cared about him respecting their rules. And then likewise, it's going to go on to talk about a demon that he casts out in verses 22 down through roughly 32. And once again, they don't care so much about the man who can be loosed from the demon as much as they care about whether or not Jesus is on their team. And so since he's not on their team, they're going to accuse him of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub, the prince of demons, not anybody on God's squad. And so look at it like this. Ultimately, when we are moving forward, we don't have permission to break God's law, but we do have a God of mercy who wrote the laws. And so he understands our heart. We talk about motives often here. We've talked about these three passages before. But because this story that we taught when we went through Matthew goes back to this passage, I thought it was a great time to bring these concepts back to mind and help us to understand it is important to have a firm understanding of what God is counseling us to do through his rules. But it's likewise important to understand what God is trying to do, like we said when Jesus is summing up all these laws. He's saying they're all summed up in love. And so if they had understood love for hungry apostles, love for a demon-possessed man, and love for a man with a withered hand, they would have understood how so much more important it would have been to take care of the needs of those people as opposed to imposing their interpretation of what the Sabbath law meant. God willing, we will have hearts that will help us understand the greater principles of the law and not lose the forest and the trees. His best to you as you go forward in him, though.